Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zilient Live, using open data to bolster resilience. We are here because of our hosts, Zilient, which is a new global network developed by Rockefeller Foundation, Thomson Reuters Foundation, On Frontiers, and Blue State Digital to share the latest updates in resilience thinking. I'm Joyce Coffee, the guest moderator. Many of you who are fans of Zilient Live are familiar with Megan Rowling, the editor for Zilient.org and a key stakeholder at Thomson Reuters. We are streaming live at Facebook, and this webinar will also be available to all in perpetuity there at the Zilient.org website. So as we launch into our webinar today, data have become increasingly more important for all types of professionals to scope, evaluate, and maintain resilience projects around the globe. But how do we, as resilience practitioners, make informed decisions and know where and how data can be used to promote sustainable development goals, transparency, and accountability? Fortunately, we have experts able to answer these very important questions. And I'm joined today by Fernando Perini, Anil Bhushan, and Thomas Bjelkeman. I want to share a little bit about each of these gentlemen with you, and then we'll go to our discussion. So Fernando Bernini is Senior Program Specialist at Canada's International Development Research Centre, where he coordinates the Open Data for Development Network, OD4D. OD4D aims to scale open data solutions that have been proven to work in the developing world, and it has supported global initiatives such as the Open Data Barometer, the Open Data Leaders Network, the School of Data, the Open Data Charter, and the International Open Data Conference. So luckily for us, they do work in Latin America, Africa, Caribbean, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and Francophone Africa as well. And of course, this initiative has hosts in many places, including the Global Affairs Canada and Hewlett Foundation. Fernando, also known as Dr. Perini, holds a PhD from the University of Sussex in the Management of Technology and Innovation. So welcome, Fernando. We're so glad you're here to share your insights with us. Anil Bhushan is the lead analyst and principal investigator for the Canadian International Development Platform, and he is also adjunct research professor at the Norman Peterson School of International Affairs in Carleton University, Ottawa. Prior to this, he was senior researcher for the Governance of Equitable Growth program at the North-South Institute, which, as we know, is a leading Canadian international development think tank. And as you will hear more about shortly, the Canadian International Development Platform is an initiative that leverages open data and big data to analyze, visualize, and discuss Canada's engagement with the developing world. His work sits at the intersection of data, technology, and international development, and this includes extensive knowledge and experience in areas including open data standards, social media big data, data management, visualizations, open source software development, and their application to international development data. Aniket holds an MA in political science from Carleton University. And finally, Thomas Bjelkeman. Thomas is the co-founder and director of Akvo Foundation. He's a systems architect and designer with both a software and environmental science background, and he is chief technology officer, and in such a way harnesses the maximum potential from open source methods. He began developing software ventures in Britain and California, working closely with many early wave internet entrepreneurs. And he himself is a serial entrepreneur, including in 1994 when he helped start Zilient CMS, which eventually sold to Oracle. And then in 1997, he co-founded the web analytics company ISSEL, and in 1999, Zilient. So all of these have been very crucial to the open data arena. And he is, in fact, completing his MSc in Environmental Science at Stockholm University. I'm Joyce Coffee, as I mentioned, and I'm the president of Climate Resilience Consulting. We are a mission-driven firm that exists to create a world with more lives saved and livelihoods enhanced in the face of climate change disruption, especially for those facing disproportionate risks to hazards. So now, without further ado, let me just offer the run of show. We're going to spend about the next 20 minutes or so talking through some very open questions, so our experts can give us the basics of their work and also respond to many of the questions that you posed as you signed up for the webinar, those of you who signed up and are not on Facebook Live. And then it's open to you. So we'll hopefully have about 30 minutes for your questions. I encourage you to look in the chat box. If you haven't discovered that in the Zoom feature yet, it's a key area to pose your questions, or on Facebook Live, there are ways to do that as well. And we'll be looking at those as we proceed. So let me start by asking Fernando and then Aniket and Tomas to describe what is open data and how do you see it in terms of both users and trends in the future in terms of your work specifically. Fernando.
Thanks, Joyce. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to join this webinar and really looking forward to the discussions. Open data basically is a very simple concept in essence. It is basically any data that's put online and made available with a license that allows use, reuse for anybody, for anything. While this is a kind of very simple thing, I guess, basically it creates like different things. I guess it creates it has been also a movement to have this more data available online with this different license since the past 10 years. And basically this has created many communities working on a wide range of issues around these different types of data that are made available online. The data sources can be, of course, coming from many different players in different types of stakeholders. It could be coming from academia, it could be coming from government, from private sector, and so on. And all of them can generate and create open data. Traditionally, the open data community has been a bit more focused on governments, on make sure that they make available the data that they collect, as long as respecting issues of privacy and so on. Because it's kind of somehow collected with taxpayers, with our money, and also it allows us to create a kind of accountability in innovation and services and so on. So I think that there has been an emphasis on my program, the D4D, as you mentioned, the Open Data for Development Network, has been focusing particularly on most of the work on kind of supporting also governments around the world to move on this direction, creating open data initiatives, understanding what works, what doesn't work, and so on. And also civil society to understand, kind of to apply these different developmental challenges that we can get into a bit more detail. But I guess I see that's the overall trend. I think the past 10 years, the open data movement has grown very, very fast around the world in many different regions. And we have been trying to support the strengthening of these communities, particularly developing countries, and create more kind of sophisticated ecosystems.
Thank you, Fernando. So Aniket, over to you. As lead analyst at the CIDA, the Canadian International Development Platform, what do you think open data is and how do you use it?
Yeah, great, thank you. I hope you can hear me okay. Again, as Fernando started, thank you to Joyce and thank you to Zilient for this invitation. I'm going to largely repeat what Fernando said, but maybe with a little inflection here and there. To me, and really, I'm speaking from the base of our work. Open data is largely public data. It's largely sort of public sector data. If you see the overall weight of open data platforms and what data is actually there, it's largely public data. It is potentially huge, and I would argue also all over the map. So I'm most familiar with Canadian open data. That's what that's the space we work in. And a quick check of the TBS, which is the Treasury Board Secretariat, which hosts our sort of Canada whole of government-wide open data platform portal, shows the top sets at the moment are everything from monthly communications reports between lobbyists and designated public office holders, to freshwater quality surveys, to socioeconomic demographic data, to payroll surveys, to soil moisture anomalies. So essentially, it's anything and everything if you look at it from one perspective. So the question is it anything different? So to understand that, I think like Fernando, I look at it from the perspective of use cases. What is the use case behind it? What is the rationale? What is the justification? And the key rationale and justification had been and sort of remains around transparency and accountability, holding public officials to account. But bear with me for a second, and this may be a little bit controversial, but it's the public officials who are making that data open. So in other words, most of it is pretty useless at being able to be leveraged to hold public officials to account in any meaningful way. That's my position. In terms of our work, our use case is quantitative analysis of Canada's engagement on development issues, and we cover 4 core pillars: foreign assistance, bilateral trade, investment, migration, and remittances. So we leverage data in all of these areas. To me, open data, in conclusion, is just data, but in theory, with certain standardizations that, again, in theory, should optimize for it to be used at scale. So things like a consistent machine-readable format, predictable, stable source, timely updates and frequency of updates. But in practice, I'm stressing the in theory, most open data, in my view, doesn't really pass even that low bar.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you so much for that. And the controversy is important, so let's bring it on. So Thomas, tell us a little bit about how AKVO uses open data and how you try to form the field.
So thank you. Thanks for having me here today. And I must say that what's been said already, I think, pretty much covers it, right? I think that's well put, and I think from my point of view, it's not so controversial to say that a lot of this data isn't actually particularly useful, but we could make it more useful. There's other types of open data available too. There's actually quite useful. So for example, everyone is familiar with things like Google Maps or other types of mapping systems. OpenStreetMap is a huge community effort to essentially map the world, give us a way to look at maps where the data is owned by the community that put the data in. And you know, you or I can actually go and change the maps when they need to. In fact, I've done so locally here when they dug up a new wetlands and changed the environment here. I went out and mapped the wetland to show that on the OpenStreetMap, and neither of the big mapping companies have actually caught up on this several years ago. So there is other type of open data too. One of the interesting things with it is that open data often is talked about as open data where what you're actually seeing is aggregated data. So data that has been collected and then somebody has interpreted this data in some way and then share it with you. And very seldom do you get to see the raw data that was collected, you know, and the raw data is often really important to understand whether the aggregation makes sense. Maybe it doesn't make sense for you. Maybe you want a different type of aggregation. So I would want to add that to do really good open data, we also need to share the raw data so that, and the way metadata around the data, in other words, describing how we collected this data, under what circumstances, what are the limitations of the data that we already understand, so that becomes much more useful. There are so many more things you can do with it if you have access to the raw data. Often people tend to be a little bit hesitant to do these things because they're afraid people are going to use it incorrectly and whatever. And I think we just have to get over that. It's, you know, we need to trust that people do the right thing, and if they don't, then we have access to the raw data too, and we can prove that they did something that wasn't appropriate for that data set. But I think what the previous two speakers have said, I think pretty much sums it up with that addition.
So Thomas, can you continue then and tell us a little bit more about what sort of tools AKVO both uses and produces with regards to open data? So what are some of these specifics?
Yeah, so at Akvo, we're a non-profit foundation, but we work with, primarily we work with governments, a lot in in Africa, in the Pacific, a little bit of South Asia, as well as NGOs. So we work with maybe 20 governments and 200 NGOs, and we provide data solutions, and they're linked. Nearly all our work is in international development, and most of our work is in either in water and sanitation issues or in agriculture. There's a variety of other areas too, and we essentially provide data pipeline from the collecting the data in the field, processing it, understanding it, etc. But we started there primarily providing tools. All of our tools are open source, but most of them are relatively complex to run. We have hundreds of organizations using these, so they're big systems to run and maintain. But what we found is that there's a lot more, the tools are good, but there's a lot more demand for the actual knowledge on how to do this stuff. So the actual process of what we call it, design, capture, understand, share, and act. That's what we call the process. And we've mapped this out into great detail onto understanding, it's not just about capturing data. You also have to understand, am I capturing the right data to answer the questions that I have? How do I do that? How do I share it? And there are a number of steps. If you don't have reasonable understanding of most of those steps, then you end up with data that doesn't get used optimally or get used at all sometimes.
So that's
what we do.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that from the perspective, Aniket, of what you mentioned vis-a-vis the data utility. And we actually have a question already from Rajiv, who's asking about what we do in least developed countries where much of the information isn't available or is actually really not even validated. So perhaps you can describe that, your response to that question, as you also talk a little bit more about the work that you do at the CIDP as it relates to specific tools and their use.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a sort of interesting dilemma here in terms of, just in my view, the divide that we still have when we look at these contexts of. So again, let me try to be a little bit broad, and I'll try to make a little bit more sense. But to me, it's quite stark that you really have quite a divide where in one part of the world, we are kind of inundated and talking very deeply about issues like, we even have terms like micro-targeting and narrow-casting and hyper-targeting. And we have massive issues around data privacy. And we're seeing, Mr. Zuckerberg yesterday, whose platform we're on, testifying in Brussels and so forth. So it's really an inescapable sort of reality. When I look in the other contexts where where most of our work and our data work happens to be, what we see is, we've got about 15% of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, number of where Canadian taxpayer dollars are spent on maternal and child health, sexual reproductive health rights, and so forth, key areas where there is not even adequate birth registration data, where there's questionable data from any sort of policymaking standpoint about base demographics. So this is quite a stark, contrast. I just want to make one other broad point, which is that, to my mind, anybody who's working, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about in our work, anybody who's working on data now in 2018, can't escape this fundamental shift that has taken place in just the base perspective on the objectivity of facts and the meaning and relevance and import of evidence. Like, what evidence do we trust? What facts are facts? And we see this when we do analysis of developing country, especially in developing country context of data, where the incentives in a way are very skewed. National statistical offices, for instance, I can think of one example that I've written about, and it's sort of publicly available, in the case of Kenya, where there is an inbuilt incentive to over-report and under-report because there are payments, for instance, tied to, let's say, enrollment rates or passing rates. So we have to be very careful about the types of things that we're setting up as incentives to go further And open data, to my mind, whether the data is open or not, doesn't end up quite being a panacea, because the onus on its interpretation, the onus on its validation, as you said, most of it is not validated, and it lies very far outside of the context of the data purveyors, the official side that's purveying, that's developing the data. So we've seen this in differences. If you look at enrollment rates and you compare it based on a national household survey versus an administrative survey conducted by the Ministry of Education. And the difference is not only in the scale and magnitude, but it's also in the trend, like what the trend is showing you about what's happening over time. So, these things are quite serious issues. And to us, data is just a fodder. We're analysts. We're not, we develop tools. Primarily what we do is visualization of data, which people can't use, IADI, other data. What we try to do is at least provide people a broad-based, primarily Canadian civil society, an entry point into finding things about themselves in the data, which most of the time they find is incorrectly represented. So that's kind of a function that we play.
Fantastic. Okay, well, so Fernando, there's a lot on the table here, but can you share a little bit with us about, your specific tools that you use at the Canadian IDRC, and in particular, how you handle this developing country question of data availability and, accountability, as it were?
Yeah, one of the things that we have been supporting for many years now, I think it's in the 5th edition, is a global it's called Open Data Barometer, that really tries we reach in 90 countries in the last edition on trying to understand which kind of data sets are available online around the world, and try to understand also some of the use that has been doing, how it has been playing in different countries, and even how the broader framework that also governs data in these countries are taking place. I guess we cannot really talk about open data without also considering issues about data protection on the other hand, correct? So we need to have the proper environment for these things. So this is something that actually Canada does really well, and obviously most of the developed countries do very well in comparison to developing countries, but also there are differences, of course. There's a very strong community in Latin America on the open data side. I think Latin America has made significant progress. There are gigantic gaps in most of Africa. And one of the things that also we have been mapping is these different uses in the different sectors. So actually, we know that whatever works in London or New York will not work in Ouaga or Dakar, or there are many contextual differences. But there are many things that happen, let's say in La Paz, that could maybe make sense a lot, be replicated in other places. And sometimes it's a community mapping of different opportunities, like using OpenStreetMap, as Thomas was mentioning. Sometimes it's different communities trying to solve specific issues, like where the schools, where the public services, how can you we had a project in Chennai, India, where we were looking at toilets, public toilets, because it was a key issue, even for women to go dark hours, to quality of this and so on, and it's connected to procurement systems that the government needs to consider where to put these things, and if they don't understand where they are, the companies will probably put there in the places that is not appropriate or just easier for them to put it rather than where it's needed. So all this sometimes it's very small solutions that you need to think about with the data, and you need to have the communities and create interaction between users and providers of this data to really improve the data. So yes, most of the data, I agree with Aniket that most of the data sometimes is pretty bad. But also as you evolve on these communities, governments start to understand that they can play together with users in developing some of the solutions for their problems, and that's a gigantic opportunity as well.
That's great. So Thomas, I'm going to turn to you to think a little bit more about resilience now. We're pivoting From the foundational questions that we wanted to share with the audience vis-a-vis, open data and what it means for you and what some of the barriers and opportunities are there, to now, just as we level set with everyone, thinking about resilience, right? And resilience, we know, is about surviving and thriving regardless of the challenge. We're talking about individual capacity, community capacity, institutional and business capacity, and systems that are resilient, that allow us to survive and adapt and grow, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses or acute shocks we experience. So when we think about resilience, and especially vis-a-vis each of your work, Thomas, I'll turn to you and just ask, what of your work connects to resilience?
I would argue all of it, right? So first, to start with something, I mean, we like controversy, right? So first, to start with, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. Essentially the world has signed on the dotted line to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We've got, another 12, 13 years to get there. And I'd argue at the current rate, we won't get there. We won't achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And why will we not do that? Because we don't have data to tell us what the situation is like today and what it is like tomorrow to work on the right things. And the groups that work with data around the Sustainable Development Goals have essentially said that internationally we're underfunding the data portion of working on the Sustainable Development Goals by $300 to $400 million per year, right? I mean, the kind of investments that are being done at the moment to extend that is like a drop in the ocean. So resilience around this stuff, well, if we don't achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, I would say we haven't reached any type of resilience. What do we do to help in this context? Everything we do is built on open source software. We really strive to make it so. And why do we think that's important? Well, we end up with governments using our tools to monitor things like the whole country's rural drinking water situation. We probably have data that tells drinking water access for people for about 150 million people at the moment in the systems that we work with all these 20 governments. And if we go bad, if I go rogue or I go bankrupt or something bad happens to the work that we do, we don't want people to be stuck in systems that they can't then take over and give somebody else to run or run themselves. We think that's a really important aspect of resilience, is actually running this stuff on open data systems, which doesn't lock you in. The other one, when it comes to resilience, is to work together and trying to figure out how do we share the data in ways that we're not just dependent on individual small single players, that we can, multiple organizations can collaborate around this in different ways and forms. It's hard to do this. We can see it in the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which where hundreds of organizations publish their international development spending in the IATI data format. But the IATI data format is so large and cumbersome and hard to agree on that it becomes really difficult to make it really useful. So that there's this pure collaboration that really we should spend more effort on. There are also potentially some techno fixes in some of this stuff, but most of it is actually about collaborating. If you don't agree on things, it doesn't really matter what technology you add to it. We can probably talk a little bit about blockchain and how this could potentially be used in this kind of context to make it a little bit easier. But again, it's I think of more of a techno fix than actually sitting down together and saying, let's work on this together and make sure that the investments are there so that we understand where we're going based on data, because I think that's critical.
Great, Thomas, thanks so much. And also thanks for mentioning, yes, Aniket, on to you just a moment, but thanks for mentioning blockchain, which will be certainly the subject of many conversations after we get through this another round here on resilience. So Aniket, over to you in response to Thomas, and also just more generally about how resilience plays into your work.
Sure. Yeah. I'm not sure how much justice I'll do to the latter. I'm glad that all of Thomas's work focuses on resilience in the core way that I understood it in terms of climate resilience and so forth. Like our work isn't quite, and isn't quite that kind of directly focused. But I agree very much with a lot of what Thomas just said, and I just wanted to pick up on that, and that's why I sort of jumped on it. So I want to pick up on a couple of things. One is on the SDGs, and I just want to talk a little bit just to kind of frame this. Again, I'm going to do the broader thing and just talk about it from a data, sort of a data project standpoint, right? One of the key things that came along with the SDGs, and Thomas is referring to this in talking about the gap in funding that there is this idea of a data revolution, right? So what we saw with the MDGs, what were the MDGs? They were essentially parsimony, right? They were boiling down a massively complex socioeconomic transformational sort of process to 8 areas and a handful of indicators underneath that, which at the time when it was conceived still had gaps. I mean, but some of those indicators were conceived in a way that there was foreknowledge that data didn't exist for them, and there wasn't really a plan, and there wasn't really an idea, but there was the concept that this is stuff that we want to measure, we want to be able to track, and this is how we're agreeing to be able to be essentially hold ourselves to account, right? To be judged by ourselves as a community of peers and so forth. I think there's been, so I've done a bit of work on this, and I'm kind of speaking from a presentation I did recently with the Paris 21 group, which has done an extensive 300 and some odd page report at a panel at our Ministry of Foreign Affairs here recently, where we looked at some of the data around the SDGs, so the meta, if you will, right? So what you find when you look at the state of play with the SDGs, and I fully agree that we won't even know whether we meet them or not, because 2/3 have no data, 88 at the indicator level have neither data nor method, 55 have some method, but no data, right? And we're talking about 232 indicators at the indicator level under the 17 goal areas, many of which, from the standpoint of a pure sort of data analyst, economist, statistician, I would say, are bordering into the realm of the unmeasurable. And I've developed a bit of a typology here to how do you think about data, right? So bear with me here. There's a typology of about 4 that I want to share, right? So the first is the directly observable, right? A lot of the stuff that Thomas is talking about, the physical phenomena, whether there's a toilet somewhere, whether there isn't, whether the ground table has water at a certain depth or another at another depth, that's a directly observable physical phenomena. The second is the conventionally measurable, right? We all agree that GDP, C plus I plus G, X minus M, whatever formulation, but largely there is a conventional measurable method. The third is the conventionally estimated, modeled, or imputed, right? There are gaps, we know there are gaps, but there's a relative convention in the profession to be able to model and impute. And the fourth, I'd argue, is really the unconventional. What I argue has happened in going from the MDGs to the SDGs is we have seen like almost no change in the first 3 categories. And we've seen a massive proliferation of the 4th category, right? And essentially a lot in this realm of the unconventional that we don't know what we're going to do with. And I'd like to leave you with one example, and I'll pause there. And to me, this is a real problem with the whole data side of the SDGs, right? And it's a problem of misspecification, right? We're hunting for things to be able to find indicators to do the job of measuring what we think we want to measure, but we're not using a starting point that is a blank slate. We're going to pick something that we know we have parts of the indicator for. So one of the SDGs of this sort is 7 point. I actually have a whole page of these, but I'm going to do one. One of the SDGs is 7.3.1, right? And this is under energy, and maybe this connects with resilience, and that's why I'm going here, Joyce. I'm trying. And the indicator here is supposed to be about energy efficiency. I think it's something to do with energy efficiency. But the way they've gone about setting it up and asking of how countries should measure and report on it is something called net energy supply divided by GDP. Now, what happens when you do this? So I did this for a brief comparison, and I looked at a country like Iceland versus a country like Canada. And it turns out that Iceland, right, which has a lot of geothermal and which has a lot of sort of environmentally more sustainable energy production, turns out to be hugely inefficient compared to Canada, which is producing a whole lot of oil sands-based, output and so forth, but as a smaller proportion of GDP. So in a way, this problem, and this is just one problem, this is just a misspecification of the indicator issue. There are sensitivity issues when you look at the types of things we want to know about gender-based violence, and there are no surveys that cover that sort of thing. There is no plan for having such a survey to cover those sorts of things. There's a whole host of issues. So I think the SDGs are really, to my mind, in some ways, and I've come to this after some reflection, have almost done a bit of a disservice here because of the way the agenda was set up. And I think, we really need some innovation here. And my plea is for breaking outside of the public sector box. I mean, the SDGs are set up as if it's governments largely who are going to measure and report and aggregate and roll up and report on this stuff. Whereas we know that most of the actionable intelligence, most of the actionable data that's out there isn't public sector data. So we really need to start to think about how that gap is going to be crossed. And I think it requires nothing short of a disruption. It's not incremental. It's not a revolution at this point.
Right.
Like, I think this data revolution with the SDGs is like,
Thanks.
failed on arrival.
Well, we're glad that you're there to help us with the revolution. It's going to be very important. And but Fernando, before we get into the revolution, because some of the questions from the audience also deal with this disruption, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your approach to resilience and also the Sustainable Development Goals as your panelists have.
Yeah, no, follow up on those questions. I mentioned, I start with SDGs and then get into some of our work. I think that the fact that you have now 170 something indicators to measure SDGs and so on kind of put a lot of pressure on national information systems, the statistical systems, that some of them are not thinking on reporting on some these that kind of were not used to. Millennium Development Goals were very targeted for developing countries, where now we have a global system. So even countries like Canada are not ready to measure all the SDGs and kind of provide all these informations. I think that the role of open data on some of these is still to kind of, traditionally, I think even the national statistics communities were not very familiar with the concept of open data. They're not really embracing open data necessarily. They were kind of the responsible for the data, the integrity, and kind of providing that analysis. So sometimes it was a challenge to their business models. I think that this has changed significantly in the last maybe 2 years around some discussions around the evolution that need to be more open. I think there's much more experimentation going on. There's appetite in the last UN meetings on kind of really taking kind of open platforms for reporting on the SDGs and so on. I think that's kind of an interesting development where the communities that were thinking more broader on data and the kind of people that were thinking of more the structure of measuring our SDGs, progress towards SDGs, are kind of intersecting and learning from each other. So, but it's still a thing that needs to move faster and needs more engagement of many actors. And of course, the issue of resilience, if you think resilience at the local level, I agree fully with Aniket, is kind of, you need to think much more broader than kind of specific indicators and so on. And it is, and if you go, we could maybe say that actually all the discussion on climate change has been on kind of one of the big wins of open data, really. Kind of there's kind of public discourse, there's so much data that was put into the kind of analysis of progress of all different types of research collaboration efforts that were kind of moving around the world and kind of trying to understand what's happening with climate around the world. So I guess that's kind of, I think is a kind of, we don't necessarily think that about the open data story, but kind of so much of the weather data and some kind of, there's so much of these water issues and so on that's made available that allows that kind of global thinking, critical views, different views about problems, validation of other people's thinking, etc. So I think that kind of is a gigantic example of how open data and specific communities evolve and have an impact on despite the deniers, I guess, on the kind of public recognition that that's a major issue. Action after that is always a challenge, I guess, but kind of that the points that are made and they're clear. And I think that kind of in terms of resilience at the local level, data plays a gigantic role, in my opinion, and the work we do, we see that kind of, if you think about not just climate, but you think about food resilience and kind of agriculture, people how can kind of understand prices and think about the kind of food systems. There obviously water, as Aniket was mentioning, understanding kind of where, kind of how different kind of contamination issues. If you think about pollution in different places, there are many kind of, we have a project in, for instance, in Cairo that kind of use like go with a car around and kind of gather all the data across the city, and then we make it available open data, and we create public discussions around pollution and how we can kind of tackle some of these issues. In Latin America, the issues around even violence and femicides, or you need the data to really kind of provide that kind of resilience in communities, I guess, thinking broader than just climate resilience, I guess, a broader definition of resilience in the community. So, and I think that some of these issues on open data also play a big role in discussions on smart cities and how cities are thinking about their data. Some of them thinking as very structured, closed systems. Some are thinking of how we really engage communities on the data and the systems that we are thinking about to control the city, I guess. And whenever kind of there are different approaches, different benefits, and I think the jury is out on where to go, I guess. But kind of you see many open systems being used, as Thomas mentioned before, on kind of Irma and Maria hurricanes in the Caribbean, kind of the open street map community, kind of monetary street map. Hundreds of volunteers work on kind of providing maps that support directly kind of a post-disaster relief effort and so on. So I think that kind of this is a broader, much broader picture of data, correct? Then kind of, but more and more the open data, I think it feeds into that resilience on communities.
Great. Thank you, Fernando. That's fantastic. And, you know, some of this question of smarter and more disruptive leads me to look at the significant number of questions we received from the audience so far about blockchain. And Thomas, I'm going to turn to you to tell us a little bit about your thoughts vis-a-vis blockchain, especially with regards to development aid and work in least development countries, and just in general, how critical blockchain technology might be to the open data movement. Where are you seeing the blockchain as a solution to inconsistencies in data and users approach?
Yeah, first of all, there's a lot of hype around blockchain. There's a lot of talk around it, and we need to take it with a bit of a grain of salt, some of this, because it's sometimes sort of portrayed as it's going to solve all our problems. I don't think so. I think it's going to solve some specific problems. Some of them we probably don't even know what they are yet. To understand what blockchain is, I just put in a link in the chat that may be useful to refer to if one is sort of a little bit fuzzy on what blockchain is, because it's not actually that complicated. I'm not going to go through it, but it's just a good reference point, I think helps to understand it. Fortunately, the work we do mostly is about measuring things that can be observed. Not everything, but mostly things that can be observed. And in this context, blockchain could be really quite useful because it can prove the provenance of your data pipeline. Essentially, in other terminology, you think of it as chain of custody. You know, data was collected over here, it was transferred to over here. Here is the data cleaning methods or whatever. Here's the visualization methods we used on this data to interpret it or, you know, do some kind of analysis on it. One could imagine using a blockchain technology on this to essentially show each step exactly what happened to the data. The data might still originate from, you know, whoever put that data in, the method that was used to put that in, might still be something that you need to understand how that impacts you. But very often there are ways of doing this that could be quite useful. Other ways where something like blockchain in my world, because I don't claim to know all the different types of applications, could be useful is actually often organizations use different types of tools to collect data about the same things. And often it becomes difficult to sometimes even compare some of that data and whatever. And the argument is, should we use Akvo's tools? Should we use somebody else's tools? You know, Kobo, mWater, whatever. There's a whole bunch of them, right? And here one could imagine that we sat down together and said, we're all going to write the data to a blockchain, which means that it doesn't matter who collects the data with what tool you do. It ends up in a place that we can see where it all is, and we can then all together use that data. You know, blockchain technology tends to be thought of as public data most of the time. It doesn't have to be, but often the biggest benefits tend to come that way. Although we're seeing things like supply chains are going to probably be hugely affected by blockchain technology, because I mean, just modern supply chains, if you buy something, it comes shipped in a container from a different country, has paper this thick, attached to each container. That's going to get automated away through blockchain most likely. Other things we could imagine is, think of a community where in each community there is somebody who actually collects data for the government, for NGOs, for whoever needs data. They have a mobile phone, they can collect the data, and they can submit it. Rather than the way it happens today, somebody pays for an enumerator, there's the government or somebody else, an NGO, and they send out somebody to collect data. And then they don't share that data. We should have open data. You could resolve some of that with open data. But then somebody else comes and collect nearly the same data, and somebody else, and it becomes a real big hassle. The community doesn't get access to its own data, and there are there's like nearly data collection fatigue in the community around these things. We could imagine another situation where you had people in the community that collected data for everyone. You teach them sufficiently that they can do that collection. And then the challenge is actually, how do you pay for that? Because you can use M-Pesa in Kenya, you might use something else in some other country, but you have then hundreds of countries where you need to implement different payment systems for everyone so that they can get it. Instead, you could potentially pay them through a cryptocurrency that would be the same across the whole environment. You could then maybe use that cryptocurrency to buy your electricity or your water or whatever. So there are ways where blockchain could interact here, where it could be useful. Some of the earlier ones I mentioned are probably going to be the easier ones to implement, because cryptocurrencies across borders in this context is harder, because it falls under many different types of rules and regulations. But that's how I look at it, and I know it's a kind of a limited point of view, because I think about how can I use this in my context, but I think it could be useful.
Great, thank you so much, Tomas. So we're going to just turn to Aniket for a brief response to that, and then we'll move on to some other of these excellent questions that are coming in. I do encourage you to use the chat box when you can. I'm also referencing the questions that you put in when you signed up for the webinar. Aniket.
Great. Fortunately, Tomas has just said pretty much everything and better, so I'm just going to try to repackage in slightly different words. In my view, we are rapidly moving to, and even in a developing country context, to what I call a sort of feedback by default world, which is there's practically a Yelp or a way of submitting some form of feedback on just about anything and everything, including on policies, including on whether an aid project is actually a project, whether something has actually been built, whether what is to be invested in is being invested in, whether the building that was supposed to be built is on track to be built, and so forth. So, so that's point one, that we're basically in a feedback by default world. And in my view, open data has a feedback loop problem, where you have a lot of giving out of the data, putting up a lot of things, and there is not enough of a sense of how do you evaluate, how do you validate the level of feedback that you're getting. So we've seen things like projects like checkmyschool.org, where parents have a right to, or have an ability to provide feedback on whether teachers are arriving at school and teaching and so on and so forth. We've seen the work of, I'll give you another example of Twaweza and some of their survey work that they've done in Tanzania around education, learning, and how those outcomes look very different if you look at official data. So there's going to be a proliferation of non-official data. So the real challenge now becomes, how do you validate this feedback, this parallel data that you're getting? And I think one of the key utilities or use cases for blockchain could be exactly that, where blockchain could help serve some of and solve some of the open data feedback loop problem, especially that which stems from the validation issue. The one other use case, which I think is just inescapable to me, is I don't even know why IADI exists. In a day where we have blockchain, I don't get what the use case for something like IADI is. If donors were really serious about transparency and accountability, they would host an open ledger, at least for a subset of their projects, and essentially cut out that mid-process where all IADI has become really, which is the International Aid Transparency Initiative, is a process of adding more and more and more complexity to a standard. So a blockchain or an open ledger, which would essentially have donors publish their information in a manner that is instantaneous and comparable instantly across each other, could be another potential use case for blockchain. So just two of those ideas to get across.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to pivot to another set of questions. And Fernando, I'm going to turn to you about the least developed country context of open data and some of those challenges. And let me tease out some of the questions specifically that we've heard. One has to do with the ethical challenges that we face with open source data and big data in developing countries. And then another would be about data quality. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but can you dig in, Fernando, on solutions around data quality, especially in its application to solutions, be they things related to predictive models or scaling up to a bigger picture. So we'll perhaps take just a minute or so in response to that question, and then we'll turn it back to Thomas to tell us a little bit more about his least developed country experience.
Okay, but I will, if it's okay, I'm just gonna reply quickly to Aniket's comments on blockchain, especially on IADI, as it actually did a lot of kind of discussions. Well, here in IDRC we did just publish a research paper on the blockchain for women development. I can put on the chat here. And I think that kind of, yes, the hype is gigantic at this point in time. So it's a solution for everything on data integrity, quality, and let me just put to the entire group here, the paper. And there are experimentations happening around the kind of, and this study explores more detail, the kind of using land titles, identity services, anti-corruption issues, electoral processes, aid distribution, remittances, agriculture, value chain, as you mentioned, food security, intellectual property rights. So applications have been kind of going far away, just beyond the cryptocurrency model. At the same time, kind of, it does require a lot of infrastructure, capacity development, policy and regulation, institutions. And I think that people think is kind of, you can put institutions aside, I guess, and just create trust on this kind of distributed system. It's not that easy, and it will be complicated. Especially on IADI, I guess I would maybe think a bit more about the kind of international aid. A lot of these kind of standards are almost like a requirement, a baseline, a requirement for any blockchain application. If you don't have the standards and structures of the data, you're not going to be able to. So whether IADI exists or not, and people disclose to a kind of third-party institution that collects that data from the aid organizations in a standard format, or you use a blockchain, you're going to need the standard, you're going to need the process behind it anyway to think through the data and the process. So whether the institutions are not trusted enough, or kind of, I think that's not necessarily the issue in this scenario. That would kind of just move away from that, I guess. But if you had systems that would allow you to follow the money longer in the value chain, so you kind of understand where the kind of aid goes, and then kind of understand how this goes to the government, and then eventually how this goes to I guess, procurement contracts that happen, how this connects with other. It would potentially give a big picture, I guess, of a better picture of aid and so on. So I think that kind of these raise questions on whether there's some value on some of these issues. But I think it's kind of, just to say, it's very early stages, and I guess probably many of the applications are adding more complexity than really solving problems. So it needs to be really think through properly. On the ethics of data, I guess, and the quality of data, I think that kind of overall the movement in general has been on pushing on this openness by default, try to move data to kind of to public eyes. I think there's a bit of I'm not sure if the open data movement have paid enough attention on issues on privacy and other issues overall. So I think that kind of and kind of potential misuses of data for things that potentially at this kind of they seem to be a useful thing to do, and kind of they're good applications, but I guess the misuse is also very kind of very prevalent, I guess. No, we see kind of on the case of data, the Cambridge Analytica is like people consent to use data for one thing, and then people take the data, mix with other things, and then does something else, which kind of a bit on the spirit of open data to some extent, to reuse data for different things. Not in this case, private data shouldn't be distributed and should respect the consent. But I guess rethinking how we kind of really understand and limit and provide kind of guidance to governments to think about a broader data governance approach, and how we create a data infrastructure that allows this inclusion and access, but also protect people's rights, tackle with misuse, work on issues around consent, privacy, kind of manipulation for different things that are not adequate. I think that we are just in early stages of really need to rethink a lot of these issues overall. So I think it's kind of a big challenge for the community.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to pose this last question, and if Aniket and Thomas, as part of the time that you respond, you want to also get into this question of least developed country data validity and ethical questions, feel free. But the final question is more about professional development. How do we ensure that there are more Fernandos, Anikets, and Thomases around the world who are capable of interpreting open data, creating platforms for its use, and applying it to the right kinds of challenges? So I wondered if I could start with you, Aniket, if you could tell me a little bit about some skills and capabilities that organizations need in order to create and find value from big data.
Yeah, that's a big question. I don't know how many. I think we need more Tomases and Fernandos. I'm not sure we need many more of me. But you know, to be very honest, what I found is you can't underestimate how important it is to be open to learning by doing. No one comes trained for this stuff because this stuff is evolving at a pace. And I was just talking about sort of the base skill layer here. In terms of my team, I can reflect on sort of my team. You know, I think having just technical people or all technical people sitting in one corner and having all domain people sitting in another corner, like, misses the point completely. But what you need is really a platform mentality, I suppose, which is, you know, essentially giving equal incentives to technical, non-technical people, and really forcing the conversation between the two. Because what the danger here with the proliferation of data, the proliferation of standards, the proliferation of tools, the proliferation of complexity of all of this, the privacy, ethics, and all of these issues, the danger here is that we lose touch with that human-centricness, which at the end of the day, the data needs to go back into something real in the real world. It needs to respond to something. And it's very easy to sit with a bunch of R, like I code in R, or sit with a bunch of R developers, or sit with a bunch of Python developers and lose complete track of that, right? You need to be able to have a sense of being able to bring a multifaceted team together. And I think there's an equal role to play in this for an English major as there is for a Python developer.
Well, that is very encouraging, very encouraging. Thank you so much. Fernando, do you have any additional thoughts on the profession and how we can increase its vitality around the world?
Yeah, I think there's just a gigantic data skills gap in many organizations that is not just the data organizations that need it. I guess we're going to have data thinking people all across our economy and organizations, institutions, and so on. So there's people are waking up for that. So there's a lot to be developed. I think that I reinforce the learning by doing a reference that Aniket mentioned that I think is really important. People need to engage in projects. There are some initiatives that tend to build kind of peer learning as well. Like we have the Open Data Leaders Network with the Open Data Institute and working regional peer networks on this space, more for governments. There's with Open Knowledge on the School of Data is also an initiative that people can get a lot of open materials to learn some of the basics and try to understand different things. But I think there's a lot of opportunities also to engage with the communities. The kind of Open Data Day hosts like 500 self-organized events around the world. So sometimes it's just engaging with the local community. We hosted International Open Data Conference that will be in Buenos Aires in Argentina in September. That brings people from 80 countries, 2,000 people will probably be there. Engaging on all these different complexities around open data. There are regional events and other activities that happen. And so I guess there's a world to be discovered and developed there. I guess there's more and more people engaged, and yeah, I'm welcome. I'll try to share some links on the different things I mentioned so people can engage and hopefully improve. Everybody needs to improve. We are always learning.
Great. Yeah, I love that. The world's our oyster in that regard. And just to remind people that in the chat box, our panelists have included quite a bit of information. So before the webinar closes in the next 5 minutes or so, please do scroll through it to capture some of those hyperlinks for your use so that we can become more savvy about open data as our panelists have. Thomas, tell us in your perspective about the professional development in the open data sphere in the next 60 seconds or so.
Well, 60 seconds, right? So first of all, I completely agree with Aniket and Fernando was saying before. There's a wealth of tools. There's lots of opportunity, but at the same time, that's probably not going to be enough. We're going to need to allow people to sort of start taking these tools and learning on the job as part of what they do, because we have a lot in front of us that needs to be done. As I mentioned briefly before, the majority of our work, even though a lot of organizations actually see us as tools providers, is actually supplying that training, that support, help to get organizations up and running to be able to do this job much better, because data can tell us a lot and we can learn a lot from data, but you can also misuse data in many different ways. If you even unknowingly, if you don't actually know how to treat it properly. It's important to understand some statistics, for example. Way too many people use data and think that they know what it says without actually understanding statistics properly. So yeah, there's a lot to do there, and we obviously together, the panelists and you know, myself and my teams and many, many, many others, we all work on trying to help on this. So there's a lot of work to do.
That's fantastic. Well, we're so grateful for your important work. I want to say from the Zilient community, thank you very much to Thomas, Aniket, and Fernando for not only sharing your expertise with us today, but also diving in so deeply to these really important questions in your everyday work. And it's profound and important. And I also want to give deep thanks to our hosts, Zilient.org. For me, they really bring resilience to life through story from around the world. And I use their weekly newsletter as a real dose of the latest insights in resilience and in the latest in sustainable development goals and many of the other themes we've talked about today. It's been a huge influence on my work to have Zilient.org as a leader in the field, and I do encourage all of you to, as we've seen in the chat box here, go to Zilient.org/user/register and get on the list. But thanks again to my panelists, and my best regards to all of you on the call who are really doing the best to make sure that we have a more profoundly great world for the future. Have a wonderful afternoon or morning. Take care.